This material captures a sprawling live panel discussion analyzing the ideological fracturing of the political right, contrasting a rising reactionary grievance culture against traditional conservative principles of institution building, using recent cultural flashpoints like Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey and the arrest of the Tate brothers as case study. So a key theme running through this material seems to be the tension between destroying institutions for clicks versus building legacy and community.
Right, and it's a massive, heavy topic. I mean, the material's exploration of the political right's internal fracturing is compelling, but the integration of cultural flashpoints feels more like a detour than a structural pillar.
Yeah, it really does.
Because you have this incredibly deep philosophical conversation happening about, societal decay and epistemology.
Oh, for sure.
Exactly why this happens, we have to look at how the material handles Christopher Nolan's, $264 million IMAX adaptation of The Odyssey?
Right, yeah, that huge section.
Exactly. The author spends pages detailing the casting choices. So you've got Elliot Page, Lupita Nyong'o, Travis Scott, and they just meticulously transcribe the panel debating whether these aesthetic choices make the film inherently woke or if it's deeply conservative.
Which is an interesting debate, but
the transition is just so jarring. The reader is thrust directly from a heavy breakdown of the Tate brothers' arrest and like Candace Owens' conspiracy theories, into what essentially reads like a highly specific movie review.
Yeah, that's exactly the weakness here. The reader is essentially abandoned on this pop culture island and forced to do all the heavy lifting to connect Nolan's aesthetic choices back to the overarching thesis.
They really are.
When you leave your audience to connect those dots on their own, you just completely lose the momentum of your argument.
Right.
They are sitting there wondering, wait, why are we talking about Lupita Nyong'o right after discussing human trafficking allegations?
I mean, I will say, just to push back a little, cultural reviews naturally tend to drift. When a panel of intellectuals gets going on a movie they have strong feelings about, that tangent is incredibly authentic.
Oh, definitely. It's realistic to help people talk.
Yeah, but it's a bit like watching a master class on architecture that suddenly turns into a review of a specific brand of paint. Fascinating, but we lose sight of the building's foundation.
That is a perfect visualization of the structural gap. So, the suggestion here is to explicitly anchor these cultural critiques to the core thesis of building versus burning down immediately upon introducing them.
Right.
Rather than letting them exist as standalone pop culture commentary. You want the cultural artifact to serve the argument, not pause it, right?
Absolutely.
Every time you bring up a piece of media, the reader should instantly understand why it belongs in this specific conversation.
So what does that actually look like in practice then? How do we seamlessly weave Nolan into this critique of political grievance?
Well, instead of simply recounting the panel's debate over whether the Odyssey is woke, you can use Nolan's overarching cinematic philosophy as a mirror.
Okay, I like that.
Because Nolan is known for his commitment to themes of ordered liberty, right? And his portrayal of these flawed, traditional anti-heroes who carry the weight of civilization.
Yes.
You can use those specific themes to highlight exactly what the reactionary right completely fails to produce.
Oh, wow, yeah. Because true conservatism is theoretically about order and institution building.
Precisely. So point out that Nolan is taking a chaotic epic and imposing rigorous, multi-million-dollar cinematic order onto it.
I see. So you are contrasting the act of creation with the act of destruction.
The budget cultural output of someone like Nolan with the panel's brief mention of that film, Citizen Vigilante.
Oh, right. The low-budget one.
Yeah, that contrast is a goldmine. You can use Citizen Vigilante's low-budget, rage-bait approach to illustrate how true conservatism requires creating excellent culture.
Not just reacting to it.
Right. It requires making something beautiful, not just producing what the panel calls slop to satisfy an appetite for grievance.
That framing changes everything, honestly, because by juxtaposing Nolan's monumental ambition with reactionary rage bait right out of the gate, the movie review completely stops being a detour.
It becomes a load-bearing pillar.
Exact. It proves the thesis that building is harder than complaining. And, that idea of building a foundation actually perfectly exposes another flaw in how this piece is constructed.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, because if Nolan's movie is the cultural foundation, the pandemic is really the psychological foundation of the entire political movement.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's look closely at the section discussing the 2019 and 2020 lockdown.
Right. And here's the topic sentence for this issue.
The conversation identifies the government's COVID-19 response as the foundational trauma driving current societal cynicism. Yet this crucial diagnostic tool appears way too late in the narrative to effectively frame the earlier arguments.
It's a classic issue of sequencing, really.
Totally.
Because the material features this absolutely brilliant, heart-wrenching point about the lockdowns, specifically locking 16 and 17-year-old boys behind screens during their most formative years.
It's a really powerful point.
It is. The author describes the devastating effect of stripping young men of real-world contact and physical community. But structurally, this revelation is just buried.
It really is.
The panel spends the entire first half of the discussion detailing the symptoms of the trauma. We read all about the Tate brothers' appeal to alienated young men.
Right.
And Candace Owens' defamation of Erica Kirk and the rejection of polite discourse.
We wade through all of that toxic behavior long before they reveal the lockdowns as the root cause.
Yes, this delayed diagnosis forces the audience to retroactively apply the framework to everything they just heard.
Think about the cognitive load that places on the reader, you know?
Oh, it's massive.
You're asking them to absorb dozens of pages of grievances, memorize the players, track the timeline, and then, at the very end, you hand them the magnifying glass they needed from page 1?
If this were a medical mystery, it feels like we spend an hour watching the doctors treat the symptoms only to reveal the actual poison in the final 5 minutes. Shouldn't we know what they drank first?
Right, exactly.
Because if we know they drank poison, every symptom that follows makes perfect sense.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of chronology and cognitive load? The suggestion here is to front-load the COVID-19 trauma hypothesis.
I love that.
Establish it as the primary thematic lens through which all the subsequent behavioral anomalies are analyzed.
So map that out for me. What does that actually look like if I'm editing?
Well, you take that brilliant section about the hubris of the global lockdowns and you move it to the very beginning of the segment analyzing the Tate brothers.
Okay, right at the top.
Yes, you explain up front that figures like the Tates or Candace Owens are capitalizing on an audience whose, and I love this phrase from the text, whose rational immune system was overwhelmed by COVID-era institutional failures.
That concept of the rational immune system is just so crucial.
It really is. You show how the lockdowns created the exact vacuum of loyalty and strength that the reactionary right filled.
Because if you don't explain that the immune system is compromised first, the infection just looks like a spontaneous anomaly.
Exactly. But if you lay that groundwork early, the subsequent discussions of their rise feel like an inevitable consequence rather than an isolated phenomenon.
It completely transforms the reading experience. The reader goes from, why are all these young men acting this way? To, oh, of course they are. They were isolated and betrayed.
It creates empathy where there was just confusion.
And that cohesive diagnostic narrative leads us perfectly into the emotional culmination of the material.
Right, the final part.
How the panel prescribes a cure for the societal sickness, and honestly, whether the tone of the piece actually supports that cure.
Which brings us to the topic sentence here. The concluding mandate for the audience to embrace optimism and build local communities is incredibly potent, but it is somewhat undermined by the sheer volume of time spent airing grievances about specific internal adversary.
Yeah, let's really break down the mechanics of this tonal imbalance, because it's fascinating.
It really is.
The panel synthesizes this truly beautiful mandate at the end. They say we need to reject the merchants of despair, focus on the local community, protect the dinner table, and embrace the theological concept of obedience over great.
It's such a striking affirmative vision.
It is, but the execution leading up to it is just exhausting.
Yeah.
The material rightly argues that the reactionary right lacks an affirmative vision, but it inadvertently mimics that same grievance culture by dedicating so much oxygen to granularly debunking specific adversaries.
Exactly. The author spends pages meticulously detailing the exact timelines of Twitter beefs and the logical fallacies used by provocateurs.
The ratio of diagnosing toxicity to prescribing hope just leans too heavily toward the former.
But, I do have to push back just a bit on this.
Okay, sure.
Because if they don't thoroughly dismantle the false claims, like the specific conspiracies surrounding Charlie Kirk's assassination, for example, don't they risk letting those lies stand unchallenged?
Well, don't they have a duty to litigate that on the page?
They absolutely have a duty to the truth. Acknowledging the reality of the rot is essential.
You can't ignore the lies.
Right.
But the suggestion here is about thematic proportionality. You should compress the specific litigation of individual grievances to proportionally expand on the actionable, optimistic prescriptions for local institution building.
Ah, thematic proportionality. I like that.
Yeah, you don't ignore the disease, but you have to ensure the cure takes precedence.
So how do we adjust the scales without losing the intellectual rigor? Give me a concrete example.
Well, rather than deep diving into the debunked claims of Candace Owens' preliminary hearing or the specific tactics of gish galloping,
Which gets so tedious to read.
it does. Instead, summarize the phenomenon of shame culture briefly as a symptom of a pre-Western mindset.
Okay, elevated to a philosophical level.
Exactly. Explain how it relies on tribal exclusion rather than individual guilt and redemption. Give it just enough space to be recognized, and then pivot much faster to the material's strongest affirmative points.
That makes so much sense. You treat the symptom philosophically rather than getting bogged down in the drama.
And once you've done that, you have all this freed up real estate to really expand on the good stuff.
Like the Jewish traditions they mention.
Yes, the traditions of the Sabbath and the Passover Seder. They act as living models for family legacy. Allow those optimistic, constructive ideas to command the majority of the runtime.
Because then you aren't just critiquing the merchants of despair, you are actively modeling the alternative.
The medium becomes the message. Do you want the reader holding a list of enemies or a blueprint for a better community when they finish?
Well, this has been a deeply enriching breakdown. To briefly recap our three main critiques. First, we looked at anchoring cultural detours to the core thesis, so they act as structural pillars rather than distractions.
Right, explicitly tying them to the building versus burning down theme.
Second, we examined the timeline, recommending that the COVID-19 trauma be moved to the front as an immediate diagnostic lens.
Front-loading that context is huge.
And third, we addressed rebalancing the tone to favor optimistic prescriptions over grievance litigation.
Yes, and the actionable summary for the listener is clear. Use the Odyssey strictly as a foil for reactionary art. Introduce the lockdown isolation before discussing the Tate brothers, and expand the beautiful final thoughts on the dinner table while trimming the time spent debating online provocateurs.
Perfect. I want to sincerely thank the listener for submitting such a philosophically rich piece. We enthusiastically invite you to submit your revised work back in for another critique once you've experimented with these adjustments. Until then, you can't cure the poison if you don't know what's in the cup.